Massachusetts. Albert's blood ran cold. He had never spoken of it, not to Sister Beth, not to Rasputin, but he had lost time. Dreams of waking in strange places, moments slipping like sand through his fingers. It had haunted him for years. He knew that accepting the invitation was a bad idea, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. Black Hollow was the kind of town that shouldn't exist. The roads leading there twisted in ways the map didn't reflect. The trees pressed too close, their roots gnarled like grasping hands. And when they arrived, the townsfolk barely acknowledged them, their expressions vacant, their movements too synchronized. At the center of town stood the old Peasley estate, a rotting Victorian house that seemed to watch them. It was the address from the letter. Chapter 2. Peasley. The man who greeted them at the door was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his skull. His voice had the clinical precision of a scientist dictating notes. "My name is Dr. Nathaniel Peasley. You are precisely on time." Sister Beth rested a hand on the handle of her old flintlock pistol. "On time for what?" Peasley gestured them inside. "I assume you wish to know the truth about your stolen years." The house was filled with books that shouldn't exist. They covered every surface, written in languages that predated humanity, bound in materials Albert didn't want to identify. Peasley led them to his study, where a massive machine, all brass gears and humming coils, stood against the far wall. "The mind is not bound to the body," Peasley explained, his fingers trailing over the dials. "There is a race older than time itself who perfected the science of mental transference." Albert's pulse quickened. He knew this legend. "The great race of Yith," he murmured. This wasn't his first encounter with them. The last was a nightmare, full of deep sorrow and shame. Peasley smiled, thin and knowing. "They steal minds, Albright, trade places with them across centuries. Your has not always been your own." Albert felt a wave of nausea. He'd had dreams of other lifetimes, other bodies, standing beneath an alien sky, surrounded by towering cone-shaped beings with clawed appendages and pulsating eyes. Not dreams, memories. "I can help you remember," Peasley said. Albert hesitated. Sister Beth's fingers curled around the handle of her knife. "This feels like a trap," Rasputin grunted. "Or a con." Peasley shook his head. "The Yithians are scientists, observers. But there is something far worse hunting you." Chapter 3. The Crawling Chaos. The room dimmed, as if the walls had absorbed the light. Peasley's voice was barely a whisper. "You are being watched by the crawling chaos. Nyarlathotep." A sharp knock echoed through the house. Not at the door, from inside the walls. Sister Beth drew a pistol. Rasputin cracked his knuckles, flames flickering to life in his palms. Albert turned to Peasley. "What did you do?" The knocking grew louder. Then something started laughing. The walls peeled open like wet paper. Albert saw impossible spaces beyond them, a city not made for human eyes, filled with colossal beings of chitin and tendrils, vast archives stretching into infinity. The Yithians. Then he saw the other figure. A tall, grinning man in a black suit, his eyes nothing but hungry voids. Nyarlathotep stepped into the room. "You're always fun to watch, Albert." His voice was silk and razors. "Every version of you, stumbling toward the same doom." Peasley screamed. His body collapsed inward, crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. His shadow kept moving. Nyarlathotep chuckled. He wasn't very important anyway. The walls shuddered. The Yithians were pulling Albert back. He felt the memories unraveling. All his lives, all his stolen years. They wanted him to return. But Nyarlathotep was not finished playing. "This is where you choose," the crawling chaos whispered. "Go back to your stolen life, or stay here with me, where I can show you everything." Sister Beth grabbed Albert's arm. "We need to go, now." Rasputin raised a hand, fire flaring to life in his palm, his eyes blazing like embers. "Not before I burn this thing back to hell." Albert felt himself splitting, his mind pulled between past and present, sanity and oblivion. He had to make a choice. Albert grabbed the machine's controls and did the only thing that made sense. He overloaded it. Lightning cracked through the room. The walls imploded, the impossible city collapsing in on itself. Nyarlathotep laughed, delighted. The world vanished. Chapter 4. Aftermath. Again. Albert awoke in the driver's seat of the Model A. Sister Beth and Rasputin were in the car, unharmed. The road stretched ahead. The trees were normal. The air was still. Black Hollow was gone. Sister at him. "Did we win?" Albert gripped the wheel. He didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. That night, Albert sat awake in his Arkham apartment, staring at the ceiling. He felt off, like he wasn't fully in his own body. He reached into his coat pocket and found something he didn't remember taking. A scrap of parchment, written in his own hand. "You must remember, he is still watching." Albert turned toward the window. A tall, grinning man in a black suit stood beneath the streetlight, watching, just watching. The call of the drowned god. Albert Albright should have burned his late uncle's papers. As a professor of folklore at Miskatonic University, he had spent his career chasing myths, treating ancient horrors as mere stories. But after inheriting Professor Angel's belongings, he realized some stories were real. The locked drawer in his uncle's desk held brittle documents, strange letters, and a bas-relief sculpture of something grotesque, a nightmare of twisting lines like churn. And then the dream started. Cyclopean cities loomed in his sleep, impossibly angled towers sinking into an endless black ocean. Whispers slithered through the corridors of his mind, a language no human should understand. It always ended the same way, with the feeling that something vast and patient was waiting beneath the waves. The documents hinted at something worse than nightmares. There was mention of an island that should not be, a lost place where an ancient being slumbered beneath the sea. Cthulhu. The name alone sent a spike of unease through him. Albert turned to two people he trusted. Alex Parker, a former military officer turned Miskatonic University investigator, and Borden, a woman of few words, but deadly intent. They had tangled with the occult before, had seen things the world refused to believe. When Albert told them what he had uncovered, they didn't laugh. "The cult isn't gone," he said. "They're still out there, waiting for the right time." Alex, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his round glasses. "Where do we start?" Albert placed his hand on an old map. "New Orleans. The swamp of the drowned god," he said. "The Louisiana bayou swallowed them whole. They followed a trail of missing persons, of whispers about strange gatherings deep in the swamps. Inspector Legrasse's raid in 1908 had put a dent in the cult, but it had not destroyed it. One night, guided by torchlight, they found the altar, a stone slab, slick with something fresh, a foul idol, watching from the shadows, and the chanting, low, guttural, scraping against the mind. Figures emerged from the darkness, bodies painted in crude symbols, their eyes wide and unblinking. The The priest at the center raised his arms, murmuring something that made Albert's teeth ache. Then the water behind them moved. Alex's pistols flashed in the night, dropping two cultists before they could react. Borden was faster, her axe cleaving through the throat of a third, but the priest only smiled. Albert felt it before he saw it. A presence beneath the water, something stirring in the blackness. The priest's voice became a shriek, an unnatural howl of devotion. Albert ripped a page from his uncle's research and shouted the words he had barely dared to read. The priest convulsed. The swamp shook. And then, silence. The cult fled into the night, leaving only the idol behind. Alex reloaded his pistols with shaking hands. That wasn't all of them. No, Albert said. His stomach turned as he looked at the idol's blank, bulging eyes. This was just a piece of it. Borden wiped the blood from her axe. Then we keep going. Albert nodded. We head for the Pacific. Johansson's testimony. Before setting sail, they tracked down an old shipping log, the records of Gustaf Johansson, a Norwegian sailor who had once encountered the same island. His notes, scribbled in desperation, spoke of his crew's terrifying discovery. Johansson and his men had stumbled upon the risen ruins of R'lyeh. When they explored its vast, impossible city, they accidentally opened a door that was never meant to be opened. They woke something up. Cthulhu rose from its tomb. Johansson's men were slaughtered, their minds shattered by the god's presence. Johansson and a handful of survivors fled back to their ship, only to find that Cthulhu was following them across the ocean. In a moment of desperation, Johansson turned the ship around and rammed the god's head. It wasn't a battle. It was a delay. The creature's form crumbled and reformed, like something made of smoke and nightmare. But for a brief moment, it staggered and fell. It bought enough time for the island to sink on its own, pulling Cthulhu back into the abyss. The realization hit Albert like a stone in the gut. Johansson had not defeated Cthulhu. He had only forced it back into its slumber. We have to do the same, Albert whispered. Alex nodded. Then we sail. The city that should not be. They found it, just as Johansson had. The island rose from the Pacific depths, its alien geometry twisting the mind. They moved cautiously, tracing Johansson's steps. The carvings along the walls seemed to shift when they looked away, as if the city itself was aware of them. Then, the door, a titanic slab of stone, covered in symbols that pulsed as if alive, and beyond it, a sound, wet, monstrous. The door moved. Something ancient and wrong was waking up. Borden struck first. Her axe slammed into the shifting stone, sending cracks through its surface. Alex fired, the bullets vanishing into the darkness beyond. It wasn't enough. Albert saw it, but with something deeper, a form too vast, too alien to comprehend, a being older than mankind. Cthulhu. Reality itself screamed as the god rose from its tomb. Albert fell to his knees, his mind shattering. The pressure of its gaze was enough to break men. He felt his thoughts unravel, his very identity dissolving into the abyss. Alex grabbed him, his voice a distant echo. Albert, move. Borden, covered in blood and smiling like a lunatic, raised her axe again. They ran back to their ship. Albert turned to Alex. We have to do what Johansson did. Alex took the wheel. The ship lurched forward, a final desperate maneuver. The bow slammed into the god's head, and for one moment, the nightmare collapsed. The island began to sink. Cthulhu's scream was not rage, but patience. It would sleep again. For now, aftermath. Albert awoke to the sound of gulls. The sun rose over an empty horizon. The island was gone. Alex sat beside him, staring at the water. Gordon stood, silent, the same unreadable look in her eyes. Albert's hands shook as he reached for his journal. He would write it down, every word. But who would believe him? The tide rolled in, and somewhere, deep beneath the waves, Cthulhu slept once more. The Arctic Outpost Incident. Chapter 1. The Station at the End of the Earth. The Miskatonic Antarctic Research Station was the last place on Earth you wanted to be for winter shift. A few metal buildings, barely insulated from the wind, surrounded by endless ice. Albert Albright had seen it before, 2 years ago. He had barely left with his sanity intact. Now, Miskatonic University had sent him and 3 others to keep watch through the long Antarctic night. One of them would make it out sane. Chapter 2. The First Incident. The Fall. Harry had been checking a vent outside the main building. Routine maintenance. Albert and Elizabeth were inside checking the logs, and Ahmed had been making tea in the kitchen. Then they heard the scream. Albert and Elizabeth ran outside, just in time to see Harry vanish into the ice. Ahmed arrived a second later, eyes widening. Jesus! What happened? Albert dropped to his knees, peering into the hole. 15 feet down, Harry was sprawled in the snow, groaning. It just opened up, he mumbled. They pulled him out, patched him up. Broken arm, nasty gash on his forehead. An accident. Except, later, when Albert checked the security cameras, he saw it. Harry had walked around the sinkhole first, stomped the ice down, deliberately weakened it. Albert said nothing. Not yet. As they sat in the common room that night, the heater humming softly against the Antarctic cold, Elizabeth poured herself a generous glass of whiskey. She took a slow sip, then shook her head. That was some bad luck, mate. Harry sat stiffly in his chair, wrapped in a thick blanket, his arm freshly bandaged. He gave a weak chuckle, rubbing his forehead where the gash had already started to scab over. Yeah, I guess. Albert studied him carefully. You sure it just opened up? It looked like you were walking in circles first. Harry blinked, frowning slightly. I don't remember doing that. I must have been disoriented. The wind was bad out there. It was hard to see. Ahmed leaned against the counter, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You weren't lost. We all saw it. You walked right to that spot, stomped around it for a while. Harry looked up, face pale. I did. Elizabeth swirled the whiskey in her glass. Yeah, mate. Like you were testing the ice. Harry swallowed, eyes darting between them. I swear, I don't remember doing that. 1 second, I was checking the vent, and the next, the ground was gone. Albert tapped his fingers against the table. All right, let's just call it a freak accident for now. But if anything else weird happens, I want to know about it immediately. Harry hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, of course. Ahmed exchanged a glance with Albert. Neither of them said it, but they were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't an accident. Chapter 3. The Second Incident. The Locked Door. 3 nights later, Albert woke up, gasping for air. At first, he thought he was having a nightmare, but then he realized his room was freezing. His breath came out in thick clouds, his skin already numb. The heater was missing. He groggily stumbled toward the door, reaching for the handle. It wouldn't budge. His fingers were stiff, the cold biting deep. If he didn't get out soon, hypothermia would set in. Bang, bang. He slammed his fists against the door. What the hell? Let me out. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was standing just outside. Then, without warning, the lock clicked open. Albert yanked the door open, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty. Except Harry's door, down the hall, was open, just a crack. Later that morning, Albert sat at the metal table in the common room, his hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. His fingers still tingled from the cold, and his breath hadn't fully evened out since waking up, locked in his freezing room. Elizabeth sat across from him, staring at him with narrowed eyes, while Ahmed leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his expression again unreadable. Harry was at the far end of the room, nursing another cup of coffee, but he looked worse than before. Paler, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. Elizabeth was the first to speak. Okay, that's two now. First, Harry takes a dive into the ice. Now someone locks you in your own goddamn room and takes your heater. And we know it was taken because there is no way you would have gone to bed without it or misplaced it. Either this place is cursed or someone's screwing with us. Ahmed exhaled through his nose. I do believe in curses, and I also believe in sabotage. He turned his gaze toward Albert. Did you hear anything before you woke up? Albert set his cup down, rubbing his temples. Not at first, just the cold. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was standing right outside my door. Elizabeth's brows lifted slightly. And let me guess, when you got out, no one was there. Albert nodded. Except Harry's door. It was cracked open. Harry, who had been staring into his coffee, finally looked up, eyes wide. Wait, are you saying I did this? Ahmed didn't move, didn't blink. We're saying your door was open when Albert checked, and you've been acting off. Harry shook his head rapidly. No way. I was asleep all night, I swear. I've barely been sleeping at all. His voice lowered. The voices? Elizabeth sat up straighter. Voices? Harry swallowed hard, gripping his cup tighter. I hear them at night. I thought it was just the wind, but now, I don't know. They whisper things. Albert's stomach twisted. What kind of things? Harry's face was pale. They say they were here before us. Silence hung over the room. Elizabeth finally let out a slow breath, shaking her head. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or whatever, but I do believe in bad signs. And that, mate, that's a bad sign. Ahmed nodded. Real or not, if something weird is going on, we need to stay sharp. He glanced at Albert. What do we do now? Albert exhaled. We keep an eye on each other. No one goes anywhere alone. And if anything else happens, anything at all, we talk about it immediately. No one disagreed. But as Albert studied Harry's face, he already knew. They were running out of time. Chapter 4. The third incident. The radio. Ahmed was the one who found it. The radio, shattered. Not just broken, smashed into pieces. Harry stood next to it. His hands were bleeding. Albert's stomach dropped. I didn't do anything, Harry said. They are the ones who did it. Ahmed let out a slow breath. We have to lock him up. Albert stood in the communications room, staring at the shattered remains of the radio. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, jaw tight. The only thing connecting them to the outside world, smashed beyond repair. And the worst part? Harry had been standing right there, his hands bleeding, smiling like he had done something good. Now, Harry was locked away in the storage wing, barricaded, contained. Ahmed sat at the table in the common room, rubbing his temples, his notebook closed beside him. Elizabeth was pacing, arms crossed, her face tense with frustration. None of them had spoken much since they dragged Harry away, but the silence couldn't last forever. Elizabeth was the first to break it. "All right, we're saying it now, out loud. He's lost it." Ahmed nodded slowly. "I didn't want to believe it, but that was deliberate. That wasn't an accident. He knew what he was doing." Albert exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, and now we're completely cut off. No radio, no backup coming until the next supply drop, and it's the dead of winter out there. If we don't handle this right, we might not make it out of here at all." Elizabeth stopped pacing, bracing her hands on the table. "So, what's the move? We can't just sit here and hope he calms down." Ahmed leaned forward. "We keep him locked away. As long as he's barricaded, he can't hurt anyone. We control the food, the water. We decide what happens next." He looked between them. "But if he gets out again, we put him down. No hesitation." Elizabeth's expression hardened, but she didn't argue. "I don't like it, but yeah, we have to be ready for that." Albert nodded. "Agreed. For now, we reinforce the barricade, make sure he stays in there. No one goes anywhere alone, and we keep watch, day and night." Elizabeth smirked humorlessly. "What's the worst that could happen, right?" No one laughed. Ahmed glanced toward the hallway, where Harry was locked away. "If he's already gone, what do you think did it? Isolation? The dark? Something else?" Albert didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the ice-covered window, out into the swirling white abyss beyond the station walls. "Something's always been here," he muttered. "Maybe it just needed someone to listen." Chapter 5. The fourth incident. The fire. At 3 a.m., the smoke alarms went off. Albert bolted out of bed, coughing, eyes burning. The main lab was on fire. But that wasn't possible. Harry was locked away. And yet, as Albert grabbed the extinguisher, he saw him on the other side of the flames. "You should have listened," Harry called through the smoke. Albert grabbed his pack, his voice tight with urgency. "We're leaving. Now." Elizabeth threw on her coat. "How?" He's watching the exits. Albert's mind was already racing. "The caves." Ahmed frowned. "The ones under the station?" Albert nodded. "I mapped them 2 years ago. There's a back exit, a way out. If we collapse the tunnel behind us, he can't follow." Elizabeth strapped on her sidearm. "And if we run into something worse down there?" Albert exhaled. "Then we hope you keep your perfect aim." Ahmed pulled a small, well-worn notebook from his pocket, flipping through its pages. Ancient symbols, rites of protection. His hand hovered over one, as if trying to decide if it was worth attempting. Then he shoved it back into his coat. There was no time for rituals. They had to run. They slipped out of the barracks, careful to avoid the main corridor. The fires had started to consume the entire research station. The smoke still clung to everything, thick and acrid. The hallway lights flickered, a sign the generator had taken damage in the blaze. They'd be in total darkness soon. Albert led them toward the hatch in the storage wing, pulling aside the stacked crates that concealed it. "I never liked this place," Ahmed muttered. Elizabeth helped him push. She replied, "I don't like it now." They pried open the heavy metal hatch, and the cold, damp breath of the earth hit them immediately. The cave yawned beneath them, black and endless. Stale, icy air drifted up from its depths. Albert motioned them forward. "Hurry." Ahmed hesitated at the threshold. "And if this is exactly where it wants us to go?" Albert met his gaze. "Then we make sure we get out first." They descended into the dark. The tunnels were worse than Albert remembered. Walls of glacial ice twisted around them like frozen ribs, shifting under their own weight with deep, groaning sighs. The ground was uneven, slick, littered with bones that were too old to be human. The air had a strange, almost electric weight to it, as if the walls themselves had memory. Ahmed whispered a prayer under his breath. Elizabeth kept her gun raised, the faint glow of their flashlights catching the shine of her pistol's barrel. Albert moved fast, mentally mapping the twists and turns. He knew the secret passage, a narrow crawl space leading to an old service tunnel that would take them out to the surface, far from the station. They had to reach it before Harry found them. But then, a sound. Distant at first, then closer. Wet footsteps on stone. Laughter. Echoing. Twisting. Not coming from one direction, but from everywhere. Elizabeth's breath caught. That's not possible. Ahmed stiffened. He's in here with us. Albert shone his flashlight behind them. The tunnel was empty, but something moved in the darkness beyond. A shape, just at the edge of the light. Tall, thin, wrong. Then the voice, clearer now. Harry spoke, but he sounded like several silent, whispering voices all at once. You can't run from us, Albert. Albert's stomach turned to ice. It wasn't just Harry's voice. There were others now, layered beneath his words. Ghostly, rasping voices, overlapping in a chorus. They were not alone in these tunnels. And then they saw them. The Shoggoth. Dozens of them. They were massive, nightmarish things, bigger than a subway train, an ever-shifting mass of bubbling, gelatinous flesh that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Countless eyes formed and disappeared across their surface, blinking in and out like sickly green lights. They surged forward, filling the tunnel, crushing the panicked penguins under its bulk as it slithered over the slick, polished floor. A floor that they and others like them had unnaturally cleared of any debris, as if something far worse had passed this way before. They ran. Albert led the way, pushing forward as the tunnel walls tightened around them. The deeper they went, the more the world seemed to close in, the air growing thick, pressured, unnatural. Ahmed cursed in Turkish. I hear them too, prayers spoken backward. Elizabeth muttered, if they get any closer, I'll shoot. The passageway narrowed. Albert's lungs burned as he reached the hidden crawl space, a narrow slit in the stone, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. This way, he shouted. Elizabeth went first, wedging herself through the gap. Ahmed followed, pushing past with a grunt. Then, a hand grabbed Albert's coat. A hand that wasn't human. It was too long, too cold, fingers stretching like bone and sinew wrapped in ice. Albert twisted, shoving himself forward, and the thing screamed, not like a man, like a storm ripping through an ancient tomb. He scrambled through the passage, heart hammering, landing hard on the stone floor of the old service tunnel. Ahmed and Elizabeth pulled him up. They ran through the service tunnel, wind howling ahead of them. Albert saw the exit, a jagged opening in the ice, moonlight bleeding through from the other side. Harry's voice wafted through the cavern behind them. You think you can leave? A shadow moved through the passageway, barreling toward them. Albert turned. Now! Elizabeth raised her gun and fired. The bullet hit the ceiling. The tunnel collapsed, stone and ice crashing down, sealing the passage behind them. Harry's scream was lost beneath the avalanche. Then, silence. Not just silence, the absence of sound, like whatever was down there had swallowed it whole. Elizabeth leaned against the ice, breathless. Holy hell. Ahmed wiped his brow. We did it. Albert wasn't so sure. Let's go. They emerged onto the surface, stumbling out into the howling wind. The research station was a distant dot in the background now, barely visible in the storm. Their snowcat was waiting. Elizabeth jumped into the passenger seat, hands shaking. Ahmed climbed into the back, silent. Albert turned the key. The engine roared to life. They left the station behind. 200 miles to the next outpost. No guarantees, no promises. Only cold, only the unknown. Madness in the Deep Sea. Chapter 1. The slow descent into madness. The world above was a distant memory. For the past 24 hours, Professor Albert Albright, Fatima Safar, and John Morgan had been sealed in the decompression chamber, their bodies slowly adjusting to the crushing depths of the North Atlantic abyssal plain. It wasn't pleasant. Some took it worse than others. Morgan had muttered something about a bad round of jungle fever being more tolerable, but none of them wanted to succumb to deep-sea madness from surfacing too fast, so they had endured. At last, the heavy iron door creaked open, releasing a burst of cold, stale air. Finally, John Morgan muttered, rolling his stiff shoulders. He adjusted his canvas belt, where a sturdy hunting knife hung beside a pouch of waterproof matches. Another hour in that tin coffin, and I'd have gone feral. Fatima stretched, cracking her neck. That was the easy part, she said, voice still thick with exhaustion. Wait until you start dreaming down here. Dreaming? The first-year investigator asked warily. She gave a tired, knowing smile. The deep has a way of speaking to those who listen. Professor Albright adjusted his spectacles and stepped through the hatch first. He wasn't as spry as the younger members of the team, but there was a steady determination in the way he moved, a presence that demanded respect without saying a word. He didn't need to be the loudest in the room. He just was. Waiting for them in the mess hall were the station crew, 4 deep-sea specialists responsible for keeping everything from the life support pumps to the diving bell in working order. At their head was a broad-shouldered man in a canvas naval coat, arms crossed, his salt and pepper beard bristling against his weathered face. This the Miskatonic team? His voice was gruff, but not unfriendly, with a New England drawl thick as molasses. Depends, John Morgan said. Are we getting fed? The crew chuckled, and the man smirked. Captain Elias Hardacre, welcome to Facility Theta 9. Grab a plate and get settled. I'll walk you through what's what. Chapter 2. The Last Warm Meal. The mess hall was a tight, steel-plated chamber, its walls lined with oil lamps and brass portholes looking into the station's dark corridors. The scent of salted pork and boiled potatoes filled the air, mingling with the ever-present staleness of recycled oxygen. Morgan wasted no time filling his tin plate, stacking it with hardtack, eggs, and a generous helping of corned beef hash. The pugilist investigator, a burly young man named Royce, eyed the food suspiciously. "This ain't fresh, is it?" he muttered. "Closest thing you'll get to it at 7 miles down," Hardacre said, filling a mug with black coffee, thick as tar. "Eat up. You'll be burning calories just staying warm." They ate in relative quiet at first, the kind of silence that comes from exhaustion rather than discomfort. Eventually, though, the banter started up again. "So," Fatima said, stirring her coffee, "what's the station like?" Hardacre leaned back, balancing his chair on 2 legs. Theta 9's one of the oldest deep-sea research stations in the world, built in 1902, meant for geothermal studies and oceanographic mapping. Miskatonic bought it in 2008, refitted it for long-term research. We run on a mix of steam turbines and hydrothermal power. Everything's redundant as hell, because if something breaks, it ain't like you can just send a telegram for parts. Morgan nodded through a mouthful of food, then swallowed. And transport? Hardacre smirked. That's where things get interesting. He reached for a stack of blueprints, unrolling them across the table. The hand-drawn schematics showed a cross-section of the station, its spindly legs anchored to the seafloor, and several submersibles and diving suits attached to the docking bay. We got two primary ways to get around down here, he explained. The DSRV-9, Mariana, that's our main deep submersible vessel. Seat 6, built like a damn ironclad, can go places the big rigs can't. Then we got the crawler subs, four-legged, slow as hell, but steady. Good for terrain mapping and salvage operations. Which one we take depends on what we're dealing with. Fatima studied the blueprint. And what are we dealing with? That's when the alarm bell rang. A slow, deliberate pinging echoed through the station. Not an emergency siren, but something older, more deliberate. The room went dead silent. Hardacre's face darkened. He stood up, adjusting his oilskin coat. That ain't supposed to be ringing. He reached for the brass tube connected to the speaking apparatus on the wall. Control, what am I hearing? A crackling voice responded. Sir, we just picked up a distress signal, unidentified, deep, really deep. Albright's brow furrowed. How deep? A pause. Then, deeper than anything should be. The room seemed colder all of a sudden. Hardacre exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down. All right, folks, finish your breakfast. John Morgan set down his fork. Lost my appetite. Chapter 3. Search for the signal. The deep submersible vessel groaned as it descended into the abyss, its reinforced hull creaking under the immense pressure. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Professor Albright, Fatima, John Morgan, the two station scientists, and the pugilist junior investigator sat in tense silence, the occasional flicker of an oil lamp casting long shadows across their faces. Outside the thick glass portholes, the ocean was a black, endless void, the beams of their spotlights cutting through it like knives through velvet. As they neared the coordinates of the distress signal, the sonar operator muttered a curse under his breath. Rising from the darkness below, a vast, ancient ruin emerged from the silt, its architecture alien and cyclopean, its towering stone monoliths defying all reason by remaining intact despite untold millennia of crushing depths. It was a city, but not one meant for human habitation. Gliding cautiously through the submerged labyrinth of ruins, the team peered out at the colossal carvings that lined the structures, their eroded shapes vaguely humanoid, yet monstrous and elongated, as if sculpted by hands that had never belonged to any known species. The distress signal's rhythmic pulse grew stronger, guiding them deeper until they reached a massive stone edifice, its gaping entrance framed by pillars etched with eerie, spiraling inscriptions. As the submersible searchlights panned across the structure, Morgan suddenly pointed ahead. Look, pockets of air. Indeed, above them, an unnatural cavern loomed, its ceiling lined with what seemed to be trapped pockets of breathable atmosphere, forming a strange, misty void above the waterline. Albright adjusted his glasses. That's where we need to go. Without hesitation, the pilot adjusted the ballast, and the submersible began its slow ascent toward the unknown. Chapter 4. Encounter in the Temple. The submersible breached the surface with a slow, unnatural lurch, the water cascading off its iron hull with an eerie silence. The mist that clung to the cavern's ceiling hung heavy in the air, thick and damp, like breath exhaled from something ancient. The only sound was the dripping of water from above and the rhythmic hum of their vessel's engine as it settled into the still pool. They stepped cautiously onto the slick stone, boots squelching against the cold, rubbery surface beneath them. The walls were glistening, covered in a thin film of moss or something far older, pulsating faintly as if still alive. The air was heavy, but strangely breathable, the pressure here unnervingly normal for a place that should have crushed them flat. Their breath came out in ghostly puffs, the temperature somehow even colder than the ocean itself. Fatima was the first to notice. "Over there," she whispered, raising her lantern. Jagged metal jutted out from the stone, its rusted surface barnacle-encrusted, tangled with tendrils of deep-sea growth. The shape was unmistakable, a pressure hull, corroded and broken, but still bearing the unmistakable insignia of the German Imperial Navy. Morgan moved closer, frowning. "That's a damn U-boat," he muttered, "but that doesn't make sense. The Germans never had anything that could come down this far. Not in 1917, not ever." Albright ran a gloved hand over the metal, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just wreckage," he murmured. "This is the wreckage of something unnatural." The rhythmic ping of the distress signal had changed. What had once been a sterile mechanical pulse had grown warmer, fluid, almost hypnotic. It wasn't a signal anymore. It was melody, low, chanted tones, layered over one another in a pattern that made the stomach turn. It was calling, beckoning, and yet the voice, if it was a voice, was unconcerned with human comprehension. Fatima pressed her fingers to her temples. "It's inside my head," she whispered. "It's singing to us." Then came the groan, a deep, wet, sucking sound, as if something was peeling itself away from the stone. They turned sharply. At the edge of their lantern light, something shifted in the darkness. A figure, hunched and wrong, its elongated limbs dragging against the slimy floor as it emerged from the shadows. The dim glow of their lamps caught the tatters of fabric still clinging to its body, a naval coat, shredded and slick with algae, its insignia barely recognizable beneath the filth of the abyss. The thing shambled forward, its gait uneven, its feet half-webbed, half-human, slapping wetly against the stone. And then they saw its face. The bulging, lidless eyes, the glistening amphibian skin, the remnants of human features stretched grotesquely over a new form that was still changing. Its mouth worked as if trying to form words, but all that came out was a thick, garbled croak, something too guttural, too alien to be speech. But its eyes were human enough, and they were mad. Morgan had his knife drawn before he could even think. "What in God's name?" he started, but Albright's voice cut through the growing panic. "No." His face was pale, but there was no surprise in his eyes, only grim recognition. "I know what this is." His fingers tightened around the strap of his satchel, as if steeling himself. "I have seen its kind before, in Innsmouth." The thing twitched, its fingers, too long, too pliant, grasping at nothing. Its babbling continued, the mangled remnants of German syllables, buried in a guttural slur of inhuman sounds. A sound neither entirely human, nor entirely deep one. A thing caught halfway between worlds, neither accepted nor rejected by either. Its mind was fractured, the insanity of the transformation still etched into its gaze. The melodic chant had not stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger. It had felt them. It had called them here. And now it was watching. Chapter 5. The First Mistake. The melody crept into their minds, threading itself through their thoughts like a slow-moving tide. It pulsed, not just in the air, but within them, resonating in their bones, in the chambers of their hearts. It was soothing in a way, like a mother's lullaby sung from the bottom of the sea. The weaker-minded among them, particularly those unaccustomed to eldritch horrors, began to sway, their gazes growing vacant, entranced. One of them, Dr. Elias Montrose, a biologist from the research station, stepped forward, his expression one of pity, not terror. "He's suffering," Montrose muttered, his voice thick with emotion, his limbs moving as if guided by invisible strength. "He's lost. We can help him." He took another step toward the twisted, amphibian shape of the German captain. "No, don't!" Albright bellowed, his voice piercing the trance. But Montrose didn't stop. Fatima and Morgan lunged forward, reaching for him, but it was too late. The creature moved with sudden, alien grace, its webbed arms and legs snapping outward like a trap. In an instant, it seized Montrose, coiling around him, its slick, muscular limbs binding him chest to chest, legs wrapped tightly like a grotesque embrace. Montrose barely had time to scream before the creature reared back, and in one violent, inhuman motion, flipped backward into the abyssal water, dragging him below. The team rushed forward, hands grasping desperately at empty air, their shouts drowned by the splash and the rising, reverberating hum of the music. Morgan cursed loudly. Fatima's face was ashen, and Albright was already scanning the surface, searching for movement, for any sign of Montrose beneath the inky depths. The pugilist junior investigator, Samuel Reed, knew it was his duty. No one else could do this. He took one breath, pulled his diving helmet over his head, and with a single nod from Albright, he leaped in after them. The water was impossibly cold, stabbing into his flesh like knives of liquid ice. Below, the darkness moved, shifting with unseen currents, the shapes of twisting limbs and coiling bodies just beyond the reach of the lantern light from above. Reed kicked hard, descending fast, chasing the fading shimmer of Montrose's struggling form as the Deep One captain pulled him deeper and deeper. The rhythmic song was deafening down here, wrapping around his skull, whispering things that had no words. He caught up, just as the captain's claws began to dig into Montrose's ribs, as if readying to drag him further into the blackness. With a grunt of pure instinct, Reed drove his fist into the creature's side, feeling the strange, rubbery tension of its skin, like striking something halfway between muscle and seaweed. The creature jerked, its bulging fish eyes locking onto Reed, and in that instant, it forgot Montrose. Reed grabbed the scientist, kicking hard, rising toward the light. The Deep One lunged after them, its fingers grasping, but Reed was faster. He struck again, knocking it back, the impact sending bubbles bursting through the blackness. For a moment, the creature hovered there, its body swaying in the tide, watching them with those mad, unreadable eyes. And then, as if hearing something beyond their understanding, it let them go, retreating into the murk, disappearing into the depths below. Breaking the surface, Reed dragged Montrose onto the stone, gasping, his arms burning from the exertion. Morgan and Fatima hauled the scientist up, who was shivering, coughing up seawater, his skin already pallid from the cold. He was alive, but something about him already felt different. Chapter 6. Rescue in the Deep. Albright's voice was firm as he surveyed the shaken crew. "We need to get Montrose back to the research station immediately. Fatima, you're in charge of his medical care, whatever he needs, and I want a full workup on him." His tone darkened. "I've seen this before." Fatima nodded, already checking Montrose's pulse. The scientist's breathing was labored, his skin clammy and too pale. He muttered something under his breath, a string of words that sounded almost like German, but twisted, warped by something unnatural. Morgan helped Reed haul Montrose toward the submersible, but Albright lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping the shadowed depths of the temple with deep suspicion. The walls here felt wrong, like they were watching. Then something caught his eye, a glint of glass, impossibly modern. His brow furrowed as he moved closer. What was modern glass doing here, in ruins that had supposedly lain undisturbed for millennia? He crouched, brushing away a layer of silt, shards of a broken container, edges smoothed by time. And there, partially buried beneath a layer of filth, a manuscript. Or rather, what had once been a manuscript, now little more than a decayed mass of pulp, unreadable and lost to the elements. But something else lay beside it, a tiny ivory idol. Albright's fingers hovered over it for a moment before he carefully picked it up. It was familiar, too familiar, but he couldn't place why. The weight of it, the smoothness of the carving, it was unlike anything he had expected to find. His mind raced with implications he dared not yet voice. He quickly pulled out a small satchel, wrapping the idol in cloth before sealing it inside a small iron tin. He would examine it later, when they were safe, if there was such a thing. Turning back to the others, he boarded the submersible. The descent had been slow and careful. The ascent was the opposite, urgent, tense, filled with the quiet, desperate breathing of men and women who had seen something they could not yet put into words. Montrose did not look good. His eyes fluttered, his hands twitching in unnatural spasms. The rhythmic, melodic signal had stopped, yet it still echoed in their minds. Spoke. Above them, the research station loomed, waiting. Chapter 7. The Noose Titans. The submersible bay was a flurry of movement the moment the vessel docked. The hatch hissed open, and Montrose was hauled onto a gurney, his limbs twitching involuntarily, his skin already taking on a clammy, almost waxen sheen. Fatima and the two station scientists rushed him down the steel-plated corridor toward the infirmary, their footsteps clanging in frantic urgency. His heart rate fluctuated wildly, jumping between erratic peaks and near stillness, as if his body couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. Though completely unconscious, his face twisted in pain, his lips moving in soundless muttering, his brow beaded with cold sweat. Something was inside him, something beyond medical explanation. Once he was out of sight, the remaining crew gathered in the central chamber, a reinforced space lined with pipes hissing steam, lanterns swaying from the slight shift in pressure as the station groaned against the deep. There was silence for a moment, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation. Then Morgan exhaled sharply, running a calloused hand through his hair. "We need to get the hell out of here." His voice was flat, firm, but there was an edge of barely controlled panic underneath it. "I don't give a damn what that thing was, or what's down here. We saw what happened to Montrose. We're next." Albright nodded slowly, but there was a glint of determination in his eye. "That's the reaction of any sane man," he admitted. "But we are not just any men. And this is not just any mission." His voice hardened. "We knew when we came down here that we were dealing with the unknowable horrors of the deep. The German sub-captain's transformation is proof that there is something far greater than we imagined at work here. The deep ones are not just folktales from Innsmouth. They are here, in these depths. And if they are here, then so is their god." Morgan's jaw clenched. "Dagon." Albright nodded grimly. "Or worse?" He glanced around at the others. "We need to figure out the connection between the German captain and the deep ones. Because if this is tied to Dagon, then we have stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. He folded his arms. And let's not be naive. The esoteric order of Dagon has spread further than we think. If this temple was part of their domain, or worse, if it was sacred ground for their kind, then we might not be alone down here. The station scientists were already pacing in frantic disbelief, their nerves shredding with every word spoken. One of them, a gaunt man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke up, his voice tight with fear. Then we need to take the large submersibles and leave. Now. Reed shook his head. We can't. The decompression process alone would kill us. You can't just rush 7 miles to the surface without turning your insides to mush. The scientist slammed a fist against the nearest bulkhead, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Then we need to move the station. It has thrusters, doesn't it? We don't have to stay here. Albright narrowed his eyes. The station did have limited mobility. It could shift along the sea floor at a slow crawl, meant for adjusting positions during long-term geological studies. But relocating wouldn't erase the problem. Something was down here with them, and it wasn't finished yet. Chapter 8. A change is in the air. The research over the past 2 days had been both enlightening and deeply unsettling. Albright sat at the central table, flipping through old reference notes, his glasses reflecting the dim lamplight. The temple wasn't always submerged, he said, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. It was once part of a landmass, perhaps a coastal shrine, before it was swallowed by the sea. The architecture, those carvings, the unnatural proportions, suggest it was built for something other than human worshippers. John Morgan, arms crossed, leaned against the steel wall. You're saying this was some kind of Dagon cult stronghold? Albright nodded. Not just a cult, a predecessor to the esoteric order of Dagon. Their name is lost to time, but the patterns are the same. This temple was a place of sacrifice, of transformation. He exhaled slowly. If the deep ones were involved then, as they are now, it would explain everything. Reed furrowed his brow. So you think whatever happened to that German captain is happening to Montrose? Albright didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped his fingers on the tabletop. I think we're seeing something that was never meant to be seen. Before anyone could respond, the intercom crackled to life. Fatima's voice came through, tense but composed. Professor Albright, there's something you need to see in the infirmary. Right now. Albright's stomach tightened. What is it? A pause. Then, I think it's best if you just come here and see for yourself. The infirmary smelled of sterile chemicals and damp air, the low hum of equipment the only sound. When they entered, all eyes turned to the farthest cot in the room. Montrose was no longer just lying unconscious. He was encased in a translucent mucus cocoon, curled into the fetal position. His skin had changed, a blue-gray pallor, the first hints of scales appearing along his arms and neck. But what struck them most was his size. His muscles had expanded grotesquely, nearly twice their original definition, his chest rising and falling in deep, unnatural breaths. And then there were the gills, delicate slits along his throat, pulsing faintly with each breath. Morgan swore under his breath. Reed took a slow step back. Albright took a long, steady breath before speaking. We're moving him. Fatima looked up sharply. What? He's going into a containment cell, Albright said firmly. We don't know what's happening to him, and we can't risk keeping him in a medical bay. Fatima squared her shoulders. Professor, this is his best chance at survival. All of the equipment we need to monitor his vitals, to slow whatever this is, it's here. And what happens when he wakes up? Albright shot back. Because he will wake up. And he won't be Montrose anymore. Silence settled over the room. The station scientists exchanged uneasy glances. Fatima exhaled, rubbing her temples. Fine, but we need to move some of the equipment with him. Otherwise, we're just putting him in a cage to die. Albright nodded. Then start moving it. Now. They were gathering what they could when Montrose's cocoon convulsed violently. Not just a spasm, but a rhythmic movement. A pulsing wave of tension rippling through the air. The lamps flickered, the temperature in the room dropping perceptibly. The air felt heavy, charged, wrong. Fatima stumbled back, hands flying to her ears. What the hell is that? Morgan's jaw clenched. Feels like pressure change, like the whole damn room is... He trailed off. Albright's fist tightened. I don't know, but the sooner we get him into containment, the better. They moved faster. Chapter 9. One by one. Dr. Ernest Wilcox, one of the station's senior biologists, moved nervously down a dim corridor, gripping a makeshift harpoon gun with sweaty hands. The overhead oil lamps flickered as if the power had dipped, leaving pockets of shifting darkness along the walkway. His breath came in short bursts. He had heard something, or maybe he had imagined it. His eyes scanned the shadows, his fingers tightening around the trigger. Then came the noise, a wet, slick squelch, like flesh peeling away from flesh. His stomach twisted, his mind screaming at him to turn around, to run, to... Something webbed and slimy clamped over his mouth and nose, muffling his panicked cry. Long clawed fingers pressed into his cheeks as something cold and rubbery wrapped around his throat. He struggled, kicked, but then he felt the sharp pain, a blade or a jagged bone spike driving deep between his ribs. His body jerked once, his harpoon gun clattering uselessly to the ground, before the thing behind him yanked him backward into the dark. Dr. Lillian Greaves had barricaded herself near the supply room, her pulse hammering in her ears. She gripped a flare gun in both hands, knuckles white. The station's corridors groaned under the shifting pressure, and the pinging on the hull had grown into a more frantic, sporadic rhythm. She heard something moving, not walking, but slithering, its wet steps sticking and peeling from the metal floor. Then she saw it. The black, glistening shape loomed at the edge of the corridor, its luminous fish eyes locking onto her. The gill slits along its throat fluttered, a sick imitation of breathing. It moved fast, faster than she expected. She fired the flare gun. The red-hot burst lit up the hall, the flare striking just below the creature's throat. It let out a horrid, wet shriek, its flesh sizzling and bubbling from the phosphorus burn. But it didn't stop moving. With inhuman strength, it lunged forward, bony claws raking across her gut. The breath was knocked from her lungs as she crashed against the bulkhead, her vision swimming. She had just enough time to see the second deep one closing in, its toothy maw gaping open, before everything went black. A low, rhythmic pounding began to emanate from the containment cell. It was slow at first, but each strike grew harder, heavier, reverberating through the metal walls of the station. Montrose had completed his metamorphosis. He wanted out. He was going to get out. The bulkhead shuddered violently, the impact sending dust and loose tools clattering to the ground. Then it came again, a second, harder impact. The door burst open, and 4 deep ones flooded into the room where Albright, Fatima, and Morgan had gathered with their weapons. Morgan didn't think. He just raised his rifle and fired. The first bullet ripped through the closest deep one, sending black ichor splattering across the steel walls. The second punched clean through another's shoulder, but in his desperation, his aim wavered. The third shot went wide, striking the wall. A horrible, groaning hiss filled the room. Then came the hissing of something else. Water. The bullet had ruptured part of the station's hull. A thin stream of seawater trickled through the hole, forming a glimmering puddle on the floor. Then another leak sprang open. Fatima's breath caught. "John, what did you do?" Morgan gritted his teeth, reloading as the deep ones rushed forward. Albright steeled himself. This was only the beginning. Chapter 10. Fight. The station had become a battleground, its corridors slick with briny ichor and the remnants of the fallen deep ones. But the air was changing now, thicker, heavier. The station was groaning from the structural damage, seawater pooling at their feet, the cold creeping in like the tide itself. Albright's gaze swept over the carnage, then toward the hallway. The containment cell was open, and Montrose was no longer inside it. His transformation was complete. He joined his new family in the fray. Albright's voice cut through the chaos. "No more guns. We can't risk any more holes in the station. We fight with harpoons and knives now." He discarded his revolver, pulling a long-bladed harpoon from a weapons crate. The others followed suit, their hands tightening around razor-edged blades and wailing spears. Fatima, blood-streaked and breathing hard, reached into her satchel and yanked out her spellbook, a leather-bound tome covered in arcane sigils, its pages thick with age and forbidden knowledge. She flipped through it quickly, eyes darting across incantations written in languages that were never meant for human tongues. The deep ones were not stopping. Their ghastly fish eyes gleamed in the dim lighting, their gills flaring, their clawed fingers twitching in the rising humidity. More of them were slithering in through ruptured bulkheads, their pale, glistening bodies crawling across walls and ceilings like eels in a feeding frenzy. Fatima spoke the words, her voice reverberating through the air, low and commanding, as if pulling from some ancient authority. The temperature in the room dropped as her magic took hold. One of the deep ones lurched forward, its webbed hands reaching, then suddenly jerked upright, stiff as a corpse baking in the sun. Its skin cracked, its moist scales drying into brittle parchment, its gills shriveling into useless slits. It let out a strangled, desperate croak, clutching at its throat as it collapsed to the floor, writhing and twitching, its body desiccating as if it had been abandoned on a beach for weeks. The others felt it too. They staggered, their movement slowing, their flesh tightening and splitting, their gill slits sealing shut. They gasped, trying to breathe in a world that no longer accommodated them. Albright and Morgan wasted no time. They rushed forward, harpoons flashing, driving the steel-tipped weapons deep into the stunned creatures' chests and throats. Morgan pinned one against a bulkhead, wrenching his harpoon upward, splitting its ribcage open. Albright threw his blade into another's bulging eye, twisting it until the thing's entire body convulsed violently and collapsed. Reed tackled one of the larger deep ones, a hulking brute with a bloated, scarred face, driving his knife straight into its gullet. It thrashed, sending black ichor spraying, but its skin was already peeling away in dry, crumbling layers. Fatima's eyes darkened as she spoke another phrase, her hands splayed out, palms downward. The remaining deep ones screeched, their jaws snapping uselessly, their limbs shriveling, their forms decaying under the cruel force of her magic. Then, finally, silence. The bodies of the deep ones littered the station, curled, twisted, dead where they fell, their gaping mouths frozen in silent agony, their black blood pooling around their withered husks. Morgan leaned against a console, his breath ragged. Tell me that was the last of them. For now, Albright said. But we need to abandon the station. One of the larger submersibles has a small decompression chamber. We need to get to it. Chapter 11. Flight. The DSR-V9. Mariana loomed in the docking bay, its steel frame gleaming under the emergency lights, as Albright, Fatima, and Morgan hurried toward it. The station groaned behind them, the bulkheads warped and weakened, the stench of salt, ichor, and death lingering in the corridors. They had barely survived. Morgan punched the external controls, the hatch sliding open with a metallic hiss. I don't know what's worse, he muttered, voice raw. The fact that we made it out, or the fact that we now know what's waiting at the bottom of the ocean. Fatima's hands were shaking, her spellbook still clutched in her arms. I saw them die, she whispered. I saw their skin crack, their gills collapse, their bodies shrivel. But I don't think we stopped anything. She swallowed hard. I think we just delayed it. Albright exhaled, stepping inside the Mariana. We were never meant to stop it. We were meant to witness it. He looked back at the station one last time. The dead lay where they had fallen, but somewhere out there, far deeper than they had dared to go, something was still waiting. Morgan slumped in the pilot's chair, his fingers dancing over the controls. He input the coordinates, locking in the Azores Islands, Portugal, the closest landmass. Autopilot engaged, he muttered. If we make it, we surface there. Albright nodded. Then let's get inside the decompression chamber. We still have a long way to go before we see the sky again. The decompression chamber doors sealed shut, the locks engaging with a dull clang. The trio stripped off their gear, blood and seawater drying on their clothes. Morgan exhaled sharply as he leaned back against the cold metal wall, his exhaustion finally crashing over him. Fatima wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes distant, her mind replaying everything she had seen. Albright sat against the opposite wall, his fingers steepled, his thoughts heavier than the sea itself. When we get back to Miskatonic, he said finally, we have to warn them. His voice was low, steady. The deep ones, Dagon, they aren't just myths. They've returned. Fatima had already closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. Morgan soon followed, the quiet hum of the submersible's engines, lulling them into a restless sleep. And then, in the silence, came a sound. A wet, glottal gulping, inhuman, unnatural, reverberating through the metal corridors of the Mariana. Somewhere, right outside the decompression chamber, hiding in the shadows of the submersible, Montrose gazed upon the sleeping professors, his body and throat resuming its sonar like pulsating call. And far off in the abyss, Dagon stirred.